Welcome everybody to week 16, the solo ship single entry strategy show. I'm Squirrel Patrol, JM to win. JM, I just was in New Orleans last weekend for the DK Live final.
Yeah, so I waited to ask you how you did, and then I asked you before we came on air, and you said let's talk about it on air. How was the weekend?
It was a great weekend. My results, I was 53rd and 90th out of 200. So I'm okay with that. I had 2 entries out of 200. I've placed one in about the top 25, the other in the top half. But the real sweat was I finished 3rd in the $20 DK Millie Maker.
No way.
And then 6th in the FanDuel Fan Championship. So that actually ended up paying much more than the
Yeah.
final entries.
You were sweating something very different from everybody else at the live final.
If Ramondre Stevenson had scored one long touchdown, let's say if he had just kept running instead of pitching the ball back, I would have won both Millie Makers.
Wild, man. So how do you play? Do you max the Millie Maker every week?
I do. I generally do. So I mean, if it's like a $5, $15, $20 on DraftKings, I do. The FanDuel Fan Championship was something I'd been accumulating tickets from like both football and NBA since August. So I actually had 136 tickets for that. And I just bought the final 14 entries. The DraftKings, sometimes like if I feel good about a slate, I'll max out the $20 DK Millie Maker, like the $4,000 ones.
Yeah. I've actually, we'll maybe talk about this next week, but I'm curious your thoughts on qualifiers too, because I thought of them. Well, actually, let's talk about it right now. I stopped playing qualifiers years ago because in my mind, the cost of the ticket is also like pays for the trip as well, right? So from that standpoint, I was like, well, maybe it's negative EV to be playing these. And then I talked to some other people who they were like, well, it's plus EV for me because like I use this to build up my brand, but you're not like a big brand builder upper. So what's the thoughts on the qualifiers? Because you attack them, you win a lot of the seats, right? Do you have any concern about the expected value of those when you're paying for the cost of the trip as well?
Not really, because I go on the trip and I enjoy that as well. It comes down to I just have been profitable, like wildly profitable at these things.
Yeah.
Since I started playing them in 2018, I do think I actually started at a good time. So I didn't know it at the time, but I started trying to qualify for live finals at the time that a lot of other players who were better than me stopped playing. So I just had a few strings of getting the max seats on FanDuel, and I'm not as efficient at it now as I was, but I think it was maybe 2018, 2020. I was getting 5-6 FanDuel basketball seats in 25 tries. I'd max it out before they were done a quarter of the contest. And that just is, and then I won the first one I ever went to, which was like FanDuel baseball final. And I kind of say like the rest is history. I got us hooked from that point on, and especially then being able to max out the seats and then moved on to DraftKings. I've maxed out the seats there a couple of times, I think with basketball, or I think I've gotten 5 seats with football once during the virtual final at home. And then I think I've gotten the max seats once for basketball.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, I miss doing the live finals. I think the last time I chased live finals was 2017. I missed the live finals, but I haven't gotten back to them. Plus, with like family and kids and everything right before Christmas, the football ones are a little tougher. But then I've also, the Millie Maker, I've typically stayed away from. Like I've played as many as 40 entries, maybe like 4 or 5 times. I've never done more than that. I was somewhat randomly, fortunately, had a 12th place finish and like a couple other like top 50 finishes on the few weekends I played it. But so much of the money's in first place that I typically haven't chased that, right? But I've started doing the MME stuff on the slant this year. And I think 5 weeks that I max entered the slant and had, 14 rosters finish in the top 100, roster finished 10th, like 5 or 6 finished top 40 or 50. And so then I started thinking, obviously Millie Maker is very much first place or nothing, but I started thinking, well, there is I do have, my mind works in such a way that I can build for first place in these contests. Right. And maybe that's something I'll pursue a little bit more next year, but yeah, I've not been an MME guy until this last couple months. And then because of that, never really attacked the Millie Maker, but yeah, interesting that you play that. every week, but a lot of the time, because it's something I've generally avoided.
Yeah, and I like to have a 150 set on both FanDuel and DraftKings. And actually, I usually intend to enter that 150 set on DraftKings in either a qualifier, like they'll have a $8 or $10 qualifier, $12 qualifier. It's 150 entries max, and you don't have as good of a chance. Like you might just be playing 1% of the entries in that instead of 3%. Where in a like a $5,000 qualifier, there's only 14 entries for DraftKings. But I like to have a 150 set for both FanDuel and DraftKings in NFL, and I had actually intended to enter that 150 set into like the slant as well, which I presume would have won the slant, if I finished third in the actual But I mean, it's a single entry show, but I do MME as well, and I found it's a way. It's the best results I've had for football for MMEing is if I have an idea for a one roster or for
absolutely,
and then just it's all variations off of that. But those variations then get players that wouldn't necessarily be on my radar if I was, it's the difference between single entry and MME. It might just be a defense, right? Like I've got one set of core players, and then it's cycling through the defenses, and it gets defenses I wouldn't have considered otherwise.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point and key to bring up on a single entry show. Several of these weeks where I've done really well in the slant, my main build, or one of my main builds, one of like my 3 max builds, ended up as like my second or fourth or fifth best out of my 150 rosters. And that's because like a big chunk of my rosters are built off of like, hey, well, here's this core that I found that I really like for single entry, and then kind of mix and match some things. So the week where I finished 10th in the slant, it was like one of my hand-built rosters that was a variation of my main build. My main build finished like 4th best out of 150. One of my 3 max finished 3rd best. And then the another week where I had several like up in the top 50, it was a variation off of my main, but it had like, Zay Jones was on there when he wasn't on my main, and like a couple other guys like that weren't on my tighter builds, but were in my large field builds and made the difference in like that extra boost up the leaderboard. So I think that single entry mindset carries over really nicely to MME, because like I said, I've been in this industry for 9 years. I've had a lot of conversations with sharp players about MME, but I came into my MME stuff with essentially no experience in MME play, and like hit the floor running. It's been like very profitable for me through just 5-6 weeks of MME play, right? Where it's like, oh, but it's because I know what I'm doing largely from like how to apply this single entry mindset over to that. I think it's very interesting kind of discussion there. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I really started as an MME player. I remember playing on DraftKings when there was no 150 limit, and like hitting on a roster like 373 out of 425 or something, right? In a baseball contest on DraftKings. But yeah, I mean, I still think you obviously have to know, like if you MME wrong, you'll lose money 150 times faster.
Yep, exactly. That's what when people say, well, yeah, like if I don't, Pete Overzet has that in his intro where he's like, if I had 150 lineups, I'd win 2, right? Like, because it's like kind of a funny thing if you really understand it, because you're like, yeah, if you're not playing well, you're just going to lose money that much faster playing 150 lineups. Like doing 150 lineups well it's taking a lot of the same things that apply to profitable play in single entry or limited entry. And then it's just saying, okay, now let's apply this to more builds. Let's increase the sample size by applying solid play to more builds, which I guess brings us to this week, where I think one of the interesting components this week is there's not going to be a lot of 30-point scores available. It's something we've had a lot this season. Weather games in a couple spots, and then a lot of high rush play rate teams. And then we've got Derrick Henry, who's gone for 200 plus yards and 2+ touchdowns in 4 straight games against the Texans. So I see that as the key decision point on this slate. I'm going to tell you how I'm seeing it, and I want to get your thoughts. So the way I'm seeing it is, if Derrick Henry fails, he still probably scores 20 points, right? Because they don't want Malik Willis to do the ball 10 and 16 times in his 2 starts. Like Derrick Henry's going to get 25 to 30 carries. The only way he doesn't is if the Texans jump out to a big lead, which is highly unlikely, or if they're just like the Titans just don't have the ball. The only way he doesn't rush for 100 yards is if the Texans jump out to a big lead, or if Derrick Henry gets like 25 to 30 carries and doesn't crack 100 yards, right? So in my mind, if I'm not playing Derrick Henry, I'm still giving him 100 yards and a touchdown, and still saying, okay, I have to compete against people who got 20 points from Derrick Henry, 23 points, whatever. In my mind, the clearest way to then, if there aren't a lot of 30-pointers available, the clearest way to move past the Derrick Henry rosters, if he scores 20 to 25, is to get the 30-pointer that the Derrick Henry rosters don't have. The clearest way to get a 30-pointer that those rosters don't have is Christian McCaffrey or Justin Jefferson, because most of those rosters won't have those guys. Similarly, if Derrick Henry hits for 35 points, the clearest way to move ahead of all the other Derrick Henry rosters, if you have Derrick Henry, is to have the guy who scores 35 plus as well, which again highlights Christian McCaffrey and Justin Jefferson. So I see this slate as like, if I'm not playing Derrick Henry, my clearest path to first place is to play Jefferson or CMC. If I'm playing Derrick Henry, my clearest path to first place is to also play Jefferson or CMC. I like Jefferson more than CMC. I don't think CMC is some sort of smash play is going to be really highly owned, but it's not even so much about like, oh, I really like these plays this week so much as it's just the strategy and theory tells me that regardless of what I think individually about these plays, like it just points me to, if I'm not playing Henry, consider these guys. If I'm playing Henry, consider these guys. So yeah, that's kind of how I've been seeing this week's slate. Curious your thoughts on that and anything else you've been seeing on top of that.
So it's interesting. We're doing the show for the first time the day before the slate, just because
right, yeah,
it's Saturday slate, and we usually record on Fridays. So it seems like chalk is like concentrating way more. I don't know if it's just because we're just one day closer to the slate itself, but I'm seeing a lot of chalk centered around the Giants Minnesota game. Justin Jefferson, and it's not even Dalvin Cook. It's like Justin Jefferson, which is fine. Like, yeah, Jefferson's a great play. But like Richie James and like Darius Slayton and Daniel Jones, and I don't know how I feel about like Richie James chalk week. So I guess one of the first things that strikes out to me is like if you start running optimal or aggregated optimal lineups from around the industry, you start seeing it looks like game stacks of the Giants Minnesota. Like it's Daniel Jones, Slayton, Richie James running back with Justin Jefferson, and TJ Hawkinson as well. So that's something that like the first thing that strikes me about the slate. I do think that Derrick Henry is a key decision point on FanDuel. He's the most expensive flex player. I think most expensive player by a few hundred, by 400 over Christian McCaffrey. But I mean, his scoring kind of sets up better on FanDuel. So it's still a little bit tough to get away from. And like you said, there's not a lot of like blow up spots for players this week where Derrick Henry is facing the Houston rush defense in December. Like I kind of feel like we've seen the story before. But the Malik Willis factor is a little bit of a wrench there. I could see the Houston defense doing really well. And then suddenly like you've got a lot of like Derrick Henry rosters that aren't, even if Henry puts up a good game, like it could be the Houston defense that is what you had to have possibly. It is possible. Like I see a situation, a lot of situations where Derrick Henry, could get 120 yards and a catch.
Exactly. Yeah.
And he's actually like torpedoing your roster, and like he's maybe thinking he had a great NFL game. But like we care about the the fantasy points. And 120 or like 14 points isn't going to cut it. And he has like a path to a good NFL game where he doesn't where he torpedoes rosters. So I think that's something to think about. I do think like the list of guys that could outscore him my list kind of goes down a little bit farther than yours. And maybe it's just the way that you're expressing it. But like I could see Jamar Chase, like Dalvin Cook, maybe even Travis Kelce. There's other guys I could see. And if Derrick Henry gets that 14 points, that like there's other guys that I would want to have on my roster.
Yeah, so there's other guys too that I think can outscore him. My thought is, who's the guys who can outscore him that won't be on Derrick Henry rosters, right? And so like from that strategy standpoint, as in like the Derrick Henry rosters can still fit. I mean, Jamar Chase is 8,300. He's not that much less expensive than Jefferson, but because he is less expensive, like people would be likelier to end up there, right? Dalvin Cook substantially less expensive than Christian McCaffrey and Justin Jefferson. So like you're likelier to see Dalvin Cook on those rosters. So I'm just thinking about like who are the guys that the Derrick Henry rosters won't have, and it's likelier to be these guys. As to the situation in Minnesota, I don't get it, right? TJ Hawkinson, his best game with Minnesota is 16 points. That's at 5,900 or at 4,900. What are we doing there, right? 11.5 points, 8.4 points, 7.3 points, 8.5 points. The Giants pass catchers. Well, actually, let's start here. Daniel Jones has one game this year above 228 passing yards. He has 3 games this year of 2 passing touchdowns. He has a bunch of games with no passing touchdowns. The Giants pass catchers as a whole, all 4 of these core guys have put up one total score that you would really want in tournaments. And I think that the dome with all the weather is part of it, but I think the bigger part of it is the recency bias. I sometimes forget how recency biased people are, but 2 weeks ago, Kirk Cousins had played 12 games. He'd gone over 300 yards once. All of a sudden, he's thrown for 400 plus in back-to-back games where they were chasing points against Detroit, chasing points against the Colts. And I think everybody's just like, oh, Kirk Cousins is going to put up another 400-yard game. And it's like the lens through which people see DFS is so different than the lens through which we see it sometimes, right? Where like what somebody did last week is practically invisible to me in my decision-making process, unless it's a changing role, right? There's no moment when I see a guy had a big game last week and I'm like, oh, he's going to have a big game again. But the field thinks that way. And I think a lot of it's just that, whereas I went through the Giants scores on the Angles podcast today, but I can do it real quickly. They scored 20 last week, 22 the week before, 20 the week before, 20 the week before, 18 the week before, 24 the week before, 13, 23, 24. This is how this team wins games. They try to keep it close. They try to win in the fourth quarter. They try to tighten up in the red, teams pick up yards, try to tighten up in the red zone. The chances of the Giants jumping out to a lead against the Vikings and forcing Kirk Cousins to throw for 400 yards is so low that, I think there will get decent scores across the board from this game, but Dalvin and Jefferson are the only guys who I see as compelling tournament plays. I'll also throw this out to you. I don't know if you've seen this, if you read the player grid yet, but Dalvin Cook, 4 games this year of 26 to 28 points. In 3 of those, Justin Jefferson also hit for 33 plus. So one of those spots, kind of like the old Titans offense, where it's everybody gets the points because they're just scoring a lot. Jefferson and Dalvin, a really interesting way to play 2 popular guys, but nobody will be playing them together. 75% of the time when Dalvin has hit, Jefferson has also hit. So I think that's an interesting way to go in that game as well.
Yeah. So mentioning the recency bias, and I fall prey to it myself. I played Rashid Shaheed on one of my live final entries, and he got that 68-yard touchdown. I think it might have been the first touchdown on the slate. And I'm like, oh, it's going to be a great day. No matter what happens from here on out, he's 3% owned. And I'm like, I'm going to play him again. He's going to be one of my, maybe not core piece, but he's going to be one of my favorite value pieces, I think, just because he's so fast. And, he can get a long touchdown. He's not necessarily affected by the wind. He's not a guy that's catching 80-yard passes in the air. He's just, taking a screen pass to the house. So he's not necessarily affected by the weather and the wind. But recency bias is funny when you miss a slate and suddenly everybody is super high on someone. And you're sitting there, why is everybody so high on this guy? Do you see it? He had 120 yards last game. And that's happened to me a few times in my DFS career. I just don't get it. Everybody loves this guy just because of what he did last week or our last game in the NBA. I think with the Minnesota Giants game, and I love the idea of playing Dalvin Cook and Justin Jefferson together. I think it's the weather impacting things, and people are seeing it's a dome game. This is one of the games that's not going to be impacted by the weather. But I think guys can still put up big scores in weather games. So I think that's going to be something that's overlooked this week. I also think it's just the pricing of the slate. There's no value, and everybody wants to get up to Derrick Henry and Christian McCaffrey. And then the value is the Giants wide receivers, but they're so tenuous. And like you said, I just can't imagine a slate breaking score from Daniel Jones, Darius Slayton and Richie James combined. But I will combine them on some rosters, and I will game stack that game in some of my 150 entries. But I think in single entry, it is great to get either away from that game or just get away from the Giants as a whole. Just because I think they're going to be super. I think we might see 30% Richie James ownership, which seems crazy. And there's other value wide receivers out there that you can pick, or you could just flip the salary structure a little bit. Instead of paying up for the big running backs, you pay down for some of the more value running backs. I think Singletary Devin Singletary, like Isaiah Pacheco, like these are guys could maybe take away from some of the more favored quarterbacks as well. And then you pay up, you have multiple spots at wide receiver, like play a Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase lineup. Pay up for some of the wide receivers. So you're just flipping the salary structure, and you're playing a more unique lineup that also gets leverage off of the other chalky lineups.
Yeah, I like that. I like that idea of the cheaper running backs. You could go like Jerick McKinnon and DeAndre Swift. You could go Devin Singletary. There's different ways you could go down there. It's interesting to me that Marquise Goodwin is coming in currently with lower ownership projections than Isaiah Hodgins. Isaiah Hodgins is 4,100. Marquise Goodwin's 4,300. Geno Smith has top 228 passing yards in 9 of his last 12 games. It's a concentrated offense. They're going to be chasing points against Kansas City. Marquise Goodwin, last time when DK Metcalf got hurt, Geno threw only 27 passes in that game, second fewest pass attempts he's thrown in any game this season. Marquise Goodwin went 4 for 67 and 2 touchdowns. Like, this is the guy who's legitimately capable of going 6 for 100 and 2 touchdowns at 4,300. Isaiah Hodgins, I don't think he's topped like 42, 43 yards this season. Yeah, I mean, I truly don't get it. And whether it's one thing, right, if we're not paying up for Stephon Diggs or paying up for Josh Allen, right? It's like these guys are priced for a standard matchup in standard weather. Well, they've got a good matchup, but bad weather, right? So their chance of hitting their salary multiplier, whatever. Shaheed, I like that play this week because, like you said, and Chris Olave's out, Jarvis Landry's out. Andy Dalton's passing yardage prop last I looked was 146.5 yards, which is lower than he's had in any game all season. And yet, like, where are those 146 passing yards going to come from? They're going to just have to scheme up short area throws to Shaheed, try to get blockers in front of him and give him a chance. Like, I could see him getting 5 targets, 6 targets, like, of the short area variety. And if he busts some of these, those are some big plays. So like, whether these windy weather games, like, there are still ways to play them. And then the cold game, like Kansas City, nobody cares about cold. Like, you look through historical numbers, it has like very little to no impact on scoring. And yet people are going to play Isaiah Hodgins over Marquise Goodwin. To me, that's pretty wild. I see this Seattle Kansas City game as like the game to target. I would love to have one Seattle piece on just about any roster I build. And then how about this? Juju Smith-Schuster, he played limited snaps in weeks 12 and 13. He was hurt in week 11. So we can throw out those games. He got hurt in week 10. We throw out those games, and his last 5 games, 25 DraftKings points, 28, 18, 22, 17. Like, those are the last 5 games where he played a full complement of snaps. His worst game was 17.8 DraftKings points. He's 5,800. I think people are just kind of overlooking him. But yeah, I really like that game as like single entry. You're finding the one spot to focus on. That's one of the games that I really like. Mahomes, Geno are 2 of the sharpest quarterback plays on this slate. You've mentioned Chase a few times. I'm interested in your thoughts there. When Patriots defense, not a defense I'm scared of for wide receivers, but they've held Tyreek Hill, Stephon Diggs, Justin Jefferson, Amon-Ra St. Brown, not DeAndre Hopkins, Devontae Adams, actually DeAndre Hopkins as well. They've held them all down. Jefferson scored 31 points. Everybody else scored like kind of in that 20 to 25 point range. So it's like guys don't get completely shut out by the Patriots the way that they do against the Jets, but it's harder for them to have like a tournament winning score. Any thoughts on that with Jamar Chase, where I don't think he'll be like low owned this week, obviously lower owned than normal, but still draw some ownership. You have any thoughts on that?
I was using more as an example of a player that I think can break a slate.
Gotcha.
It's going to be low, and I put like Travis Kelce in that same bucket. Guys that I would spend up for in place of like Christian McCaffrey or Derrick Henry or Justin Jefferson. Not that I want to exclude all 3 of those guys from my rosters, but I think the 3 of them are going to be very highly owned with this like very tenuous chalk. And what I would do is maybe play like 2 of them, pay up for another player, like pay up for like Dalvin Cook, pay up for Saquon Barkley is an interesting play. Not necessarily that I love Saquon Barkley, but like, what if he gets like, it's definitely conceivable he get 2-3 touchdowns, and that's the Giants offense. And then suddenly these Isaiah Hodgins, Richie James, rosters like the Darius Slayton, like suddenly like, oh wow, okay, so like if you run if you run Saquon Barkley against Justin Jefferson, that's a thing that would hit with that game still going off and being like the game you need to have. But it's very different from a lot of the roster constructions you're going to see this weekend.
Yeah, I mean, I would be perfectly content to have 0% Richie James Jr.
Like it's going to be 35% less than
like sub 3% Isaiah Hodgins and sub 5% Darius Slayton. It's just, and it's not that I think those are bad plays. It's just like they're not great plays, and if the field is on them, the edge, and like if I lose a week because that's the chalk that hits, I'm okay with that. There's other weeks where it's like, hey, this is pretty solid chalk, and I'll ride the chalk here and be different in other spots. But weeks with really fragile chalk, if the really fragile chalk is the reason I lose, if it hits, it's the reason I lose, I'm 100% fine with that week in and week out, because that's always going to make you money over time to avoid really fragile chalk. Another guy who I think is interesting is AJ Brown. I think that with Minshew under center, Jalen Hurts is averaging 11 rush attempts per game. Last year, Miles Sanders had 24 carries in Minshew's start. His second most carries in a game last year was 18. So that's a 33% boost from his other highest carry game. So Miles Sanders gets probably a few more carries than normal, but also maybe a few more pass attempts than normal. And I think that people will look to Goddard, but not to AJ Brown, because they don't want to look like, well, Minshew's under center. I don't want to spend this big salary on AJ Brown. I think he's interesting. I think, Amon-Ra St. Brown, not a great game environment for him to have a huge game, but he's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think there's some fun ways that you can get different on this slate, on tighter builds, where it's like, hey, this is just a sharper way to play this slate. And yeah, I mean, some of those guys, some of the running backs you mentioned, really like the Dalvin Cook call, Ramondre Stevenson, Tony Pollard, just a number of guys who are interesting this week outside of just these, like the clear chalky way to build for sure.
Yeah, I think it all kind of starts at quarterback. Like you mentioned Minshew, I think he'll be highly owned. I think the ownership is going to go Daniel Jones and then Minshew, which is why would you not play Patrick Mahomes? Like you can find some value plays. They don't have to be the chalky value plays. Find some value such as Marquise Goodwin, and then you can pay up for Mahomes or at least Geno Smith. I think it's a great slate for single entry to play, to get different at quarterback, especially if that different means you're not playing Daniel Jones.
You're still playing optimal plays.
Yeah, like Minshew makes some sense to me because he's actually much cheaper. He's priced to be the backup. Then there's a sudden change, so like Minshew could still go out and get 250 yards, 2 touchdowns, and like 4,800 or on DraftKings. I think it's like 6,000 or sub 6,000 on FanDuel. You can play Minshew, you can stack him with Goddard or AJ Brown, and then still have a game stack from another game, and that's a way that a roster can hit. Like Minshew just does enough at his salary, and playing him at his salary allows you to play like Travis Kelce, and like Kelce gets 2-3 touchdowns from Mahomes. Then instead of having to have Mahomes, you just had to have Kelce, or you just had to have like Justin Jefferson or something like that. So you're playing Minshew with AJ Brown or Goddard, stacking another game and getting the points, from an offense where the same guy gets multiple touchdowns. I don't like the Daniel Jones call. And there's kind of limited quarterbacks because I'm going to avoid the quarterbacks in the really low point total games.
Yeah.
But while still going for maybe some of the running backs or wide receivers, there's really a limited pool of quarterbacks. So I like the idea of spending up or just playing one of the other less chalkier quarterbacks.
Yeah, I wish that Taysom Hill were 4K instead of 4,800, because this week with the weather and no Mark Ingram and no wide receivers, I could see them leaning on Taysom Hill, right? Like and just giving him one of these like 14 to 30 point DraftKings games, but it's not worth the risk. Maybe like one Millie Maker roster, but it's not worth the risk. Otherwise, but yeah, if he were 4K, he would actually be a really interesting way to go at quarterback on this weird slate this week, especially in large field play, not in single entry. But yeah, single entry, 3-entry max, tighter builds. Like I would be fine going 100% Mahomes and Geno and just being like, okay, you guys try to beat my scores that I'm getting here, right? Because like we know that Geno is still putting up 22 to 24 points most weeks, even if he's not putting up like a 28 pointer. We know that Mahomes is going to put up 30 points at a higher clip than really anybody else in the NFL. And so it's like, if everyone wants to get cute with Kirk Cousins and Daniel Jones, and I do like the Minshew play as well, but if everybody wants to get cute with some of these other spots, it's like, cool. You like, if you guys match what I do with Geno and Mahomes, fine. Like, then I can try to beat you in other spots, but it's hard for me to see me falling behind the field if I'm playing Geno and Mahomes and they're playing Cousins and Daniel Jones, right? Like worst case, I'm like matching them, and then I can separate in another spot. But in most scenarios, I'm going to separate there. Jared Goff is the only other guy who really like I could, if I play like 10 rosters that go into single entry, 3-entry max, I might have one Burrow build out of those 10. But really, like if I'm talking about single entry, 3-entry, Goff is the other guy who kind of stands out to me. And then larger field, I could see some Huntley. I could see like a couple other fun things where you could take on a low floor to target some upside. But yeah, it's like Mahomes, Geno, Minshew, and Goff for me on tighter builds.
Yeah, I think it's a week to have a more concentrated quarterback pool. I would maybe throw in some Justin Fields, use Justin Fields, and then just with no other pieces, or maybe just Cole Kmet, and then from the Bears, and then you can actually fit in another game stack or a mini game stack in that same lineup. I actually like the idea. There's players in Washington that I like Terry McLaurin, and Dotson. There's some players on San Francisco I like Christian McCaffrey, and George Kittle. Actually, I think Scott Barrett had a thing pointing out the splits with George Kittle when Debo is playing and when Debo is limited or not playing. And it makes sense. Like George Kittle is one of those guys that seems to come out of nowhere suddenly and break a slate a few times a year and then just goes back to blocking. But I like the idea of like you could play Justin Fields and then have like a San Francisco Washington mini stack and then maybe another mini stack from another game. Yeah,
Mike Johnson also highlighted on OWS this week that I think it's the last 7 games that Debo has been limited or out. Kittle's averaging, I think it's 21.6 DraftKings points per game across those 7 games. That's a like decent size sample size too, at his price tag. And then also there's guys who like people want to play Chris Moore at 4,700, but not Brandon Cooks at 4,900. People want to play Isaiah Hodgins at 4,100, but not Brandon Cooks at 4,900. So I think guys like Brandon Cooks, Drake London are interesting. Like, yeah, there's just a lot of fun ways to be different on this slate while playing plays that are either as good as or better than what the field is going to be chasing this week. I think that Shaheed, I think that Dotson, I think that Goodwin, Drake London, Brandon Cooks, all these guys are interesting to me. All of them open up salary for some of these other things that you want to do. And none of them are going to be as highly owned as like Isaiah Hodgins and Richie James Jr. So yeah, I mean, there's to me, there's plenty to like on this slate from a standpoint of ugly slate, but I feel like the direction that the field is going gives us like a really nice path to first place by just saying, okay, cool. Like it's not bad what the field is doing, but this isn't a normal week of chalk. This is very fragile chalk week. And so there are plays that are as good as or better than those plays that we can get on instead and be different. And then we're competing into a smaller part of the field. And then it's just like, how do we beat that portion of the field to get to first place?
Yeah, there's actually one other value wide receiver. Is it Tyquan Thornton on New England? I think he was highly drafted, and we've seen a bunch of the rookie wide receivers start to take over a little bit. But I think Thornton hasn't seemed to have done that in New England, and they do seem to have like a stable of guys. But I know like you pay a little bit of attention to the Patriots. Do you have any thoughts on him? I know it's kind of a random wide receiver to throw.
Yeah, no, I mean, I had like 20% Thornton in week 6 when he put up 21.3 points, but that was his second game. And it was like, oh, the Patriots are going to start featuring him and kind of involving him. And in that game, he had 5 targets. He had 3 carries. That was the last time he had a carry, which is really bizarre to me. It was like so he was a 2nd round pick. People felt like it was a reach. He's a speed guy. And it was kind of this thing of like, oh, well, the Patriots are going to find ways to get him the ball in space, right? They're going to have a plan for how to use him. And then it looked like that. In his first game, he had 2 targets and he had no carries in that first game. The second game, he had 5 targets, 3 carries, and then the carries have dried up, the targets have dried up. So yeah, I mean, I think he's on the field all the time, but it's a lot of short area throws, kind of like, hey, see if you can go score a touchdown with this. I think that offense is a little dysfunctional, but I'm not against the Tyquan Thornton play. I'm not against the Aguilar play either. Like Aguilar, basically most of his games is 6 to 8 points, and then he has an 18-pointer, a 26-pointer, But with Devontae Parker out, I mean, they really want Jacoby to be their 1A, Parker to be their 1B. With Parker out, like Thornton and Aguilar are going to have opportunities here. So, yeah, I'm not against Tyquan Thornton. I'm not against Aguilar either. Probably not going to be on my tighter builds, but the ceiling is there. The floor is just really low.
Okay, yeah. I mean, yeah, he might not get a catch, so maybe not somebody worth trying to sneak in single entry, but maybe for multi-entry builds, he's somebody.
Yeah, for sure. And opposite of Burrow and Chase build, I think that one of these Patriots wideouts becomes really interesting, because then you set up a scenario where the Patriots are chasing points, they're having to throw a little bit more, and maybe one of these guys can hit in response.
Okay. All right. Any final thoughts on the week?
No, it's fun to do the show. It's always fun to do it with a little bit more information in hand. So Merry Christmas to all, and to all. See you at the top of the leaderboards.
Yeah, happy holidays. Happy Draftkings and FanDuel holidays. Yeah, see you guys next week.